Welcome to FutureBridge Foresights, where we're going to explore the pivotal change shaping industries today. I'm Chris Guerin. I'm a client partner for FutureBridge. I'm going to be your moderator, your strategist for this session. Our episode is entitled Trump's Tariffs and the Shockwave Curve, Automotive at a Crossroads. We're diving into how renewed trade policy threats, particularly Donald Trump's proposed universal 10% tariff and 125% tariff on Chinese EVs, how is it reshaping the automotive industry and global trade? Joining me today is our technical expert, Arvind Sawakar, Senior Director, FutureBridge Mobility Practice. Arvind, great to have you here today.
My pleasure, Chris, and it's always good to be, joining these sessions with you. They're always very interesting. Uh, First of all, you're right, Chris. We are seeing not just the ripple effects, but seismic shifts in the value chain with tariffs acting like tectonic shocks. And the shockwave curve definitely will help us trace how those policy jolts ripple through the OEM strategy, the supplier viability, and the innovation pathways.
Thanks. And for the listeners, for everybody, think of the shockwave curve like this. A macro shock, say a sudden tariff hike, triggers immediate cost spikes, followed by delayed disruptions like R&D freezes, supplier exits, long-term platform redesigns. And that's the lens that we're using through today's discussion. Before we dive into the first shockwave, here's how we'll navigate today's session. Because these aren't just policy moves, they're strategic shocks reshaping global mobility in real time. We're structuring this conversation through 6 tightly interlinked segments, each representing a key phase in how these tariff shocks ripple through the automotive world. So the areas that we're going to cover is the global policy shock impact. We'll begin with the immediate, the US-China tariff rollback, Trump's proposed 10% to 125% tariffs. What's real? What's tactical? What does it trigger next? Then we're going to look at the value chain fallout. Next, we'll zoom into the value chain from OEMs to tier 2 suppliers. We'll unpack who bears the cost, who loses leverage, what are the parts at the chain that are at risk of breaking. Then we'll break down into regional realignment. We'll pull into the geopolitical map. Are we heading towards trade blocs? What's the role of the US, EU, China, emerging players like India, and who is positioned to adapt the fastest? After that, we're going to have a look at the strategic investment and foresight. We're going to follow the capital. We're going to examine how automakers and suppliers are redirecting investments in plants, in platform, and partnerships to hedge against the volatility and secure long-term advantage. And then the shockwave curve, the strategic tool, will bring in our key foresight framework, the shockwave curve. It's not just a reaction map, but a decision-making tool to anticipate second, third order impacts across innovation, talent, and market leadership. And then lastly, we'll look at 2030 and future scenarios. We'll project forward. What are the plausible futures? A fragmented auto world or a rebirth of modular, resilient, innovation-driven ecosystems? And to close, we'll each leave you with a boardroom reflection. Something sharp, strategic, maybe a bit uncomfortable, to help you stay shockwave ready. So let's get straight into it. Arvind, when Trump imposed steel and aluminium tariffs in 2018, the automakers faced around 5.6 billion in annual extra material costs.
Right.
A 25% steel tariff alone added $1,000 to a vehicle. If these 2025 proposals go through, are we looking at a repeat? Or is it something structurally different this time? I guess before we go deeper, let's pause on yesterday's key development. The US and China agreed to a 90-day easing of tariffs. US tariffs on Chinese goods will drop from 145 to 30%. China will lower its tariffs on US goods from 125 to 10. Arvind, this is a dramatic shift. Is it a genuine step forward towards de-escalation, or is it just a strategic pause?
First of all, Chris, I think it's a very, very interesting development. But again, we will have to, look at it from a short-term tactical de-escalation perspective. These moves are designed to ease market anxiety, but the strategic goals remain, totally unchanged. Both sides are recalibrating, they are not retreating. So what this tells us is that tariffs are being used to generate very specific negotiating leverage.
Right, yes. And even if the tariffs temporarily drop, the aftershocks, they continue. And that
Right.
brings us back to the shockwave curve. These tariffs may be serving their immediate diplomatic purpose, but their long-term tail effects show how OEMs will reassess platforms, pause R&D, or permanently shift their footprint.
You're absolutely right, Chris, and that's why the shockwave curve matters. It captures how short-term shocks ripple into long-term structural change. A temporary easing doesn't undo the fact that companies have already begun restructuring their supply chains and rethinking the market exposure. So those shifts aren't being reversed; they are accelerating as we speak. The new proposals are definitely broader and sharper. The 2018 tariffs were targeted at raw inputs. What is being proposed now goes much, much deeper than that across the entire product categories, including the finished vehicles and components, with strategic precision targeting the EVs and battery tech. So yes, uh, there will be cost pressure again, but now it is layered with geopolitical signaling and direct market interference.
Okay. So it's not just economic policy, it's industrial warfare.
No?
And I guess the question is, did we learn anything from the last time around? We saw retaliation from China, Canada, Europe, and a 1% drag on the US GDP. Forecasts of up to 195,000 jobs lost if the tariffs had gone through. Did anybody actually win that trade war?
Well, Chris, it's a very interesting question, but the short answer is a no. uh, the US did not get significant, reshoring, and supply chains fragmented. Now, this is where China doubled down on scaling EV capacity and built, stronger trade ties with the global South. Now, the EU diverted, strategy towards resilience, and the outcome was more global complexity and, not so much of clarity, unfortunately.
Right, yeah. But let's not forget, companies like GM and Ford warned at the time that tariffs would wipe out profit margins. Tesla slashed prices in China to stay competitive. Meanwhile, consumers saw higher sticker prices across all the segments. So Let's look at the value chain. Let's go down the value chain, starting with OEMs. Who's vulnerable there?
Well, this is one of the most important, segments where we, talk about the value chain and the implications across the value chain. So I'll take a couple of minutes to answer that, point by point. Let's start with the first question that you have, which is, starting with the OEMs. Now, frankly, almost everyone, no automaker is immune. We can look at the industry research. There are so many multiple investigations already being done there. But one particularly that grabs the attention is the study from the CAR, which is Center for Automotive Research, and that estimated that a uniform 25% auto tariff would cost about $107.7 billion in costs for the US automakers and shaving the production by 6.8 million vehicles. It is absolutely eye opening. And virtually every OEM relies on cross border parts or assembly. For example, there was a recent report by S&P Global, and that points out very clearly roughly 5.3 million light vehicles that are built in Canada and Mexico each year, which is about 70% of, about 70% of which gets sold in the US. Now, many vehicles assembled in the US use either Mexican or Canadian made engines, electronics, and chassis components. So if those parts now face 25% duties, every automaker is going to pay up. If you look at Detroit 3 and transplants like Toyota, or VW or the luxury brands, they all have exposure. Some US based plants also import specialized parts from China, Japan, or Korea, which under the broad tariffs could also be hit. And the result is going to be higher sticker prices or lower margins. We have seen car makers warning all the analysts that they could, face billions in new costs if these measures, stick.
Yeah, sure. So what about the suppliers underneath that value chain?
Well, they're squeezed as well, right? If you see tier one suppliers of various components like the airbags, the seats, the batteries, they're often global companies. They are seeing steel, semiconductor, and electronics inputs get more expensive. If they can't push those costs to the OEMs, their margins will collapse significantly. And when you look at the tier two suppliers, the smaller firms are making specialized components and they are even more at risk. In a 25% duty scenario, the tier twos with Mexico slash Canada footprints, they must negotiate cost sharing with the tier ones who then go back to the OEMs. Now, those negotiations can delay the payments, they can disrupt cash flow and even cause production hiccups if unresolved. Beyond autos, recall the tariffs on steel and aluminum because over 60% of cars mass is in those materials and taxing them literally lifts raw material costs. So all the industry analysts, they've already said that uh, the section 232 tariffs alone will drive up new vehicle prices because the average car has a huge steel aluminum content. And at the tier 2 level, the companies already operate on razor thin margins. Added duties and slower OEM orders could force smaller, suppliers completely out of business. And a worst case shockwave, that is tier one struggles, and that cascades down, leaving tier two bankrupt or unable to invest in the new product. And that's why this segment, the so-called value chain domino, is absolutely so critical.
So with all that in mind, what advantage is there in being domestic or compliant with US MCA?
Oh, that's a very probing question, Chris. And if you see, complying fully with USMCA is the current ace. The White House is already offering credits, so the automakers get up to 15% of vehicle value credited toward imported parts if they build in the US. Also, the US, Mexico, Canada parts that meet the origin rules will remain duty free. So the automakers that can shift more assembly and sourcing to the three neighbors gain a tariff carve out. And contrast now that with China, Chris. If you see, the Chinese made inputs are getting no relief. The administration has explicitly excluded Chinese parts from these credits, leaving them facing about 145% in total US duties. So, if a tier 1 supplier imports a brake module from China, it still pays up. Whereas a module made in Ohio from Mexican steel might be safe. Now, what happens? What happens in the long run? These pressures will remap the supply chains. Some companies might invest in new plants in Mexico or the US to qualify for the relief, but others might decouple completely. It's a great example of our shockwave curve, which is the immediate cost shock, that focuses on, the tariffs hit prices today, and the midterm rearrangement wherein the supply chains start pivoting, and the long-term ecosystem change where new regional hubs, start emerging. That's what we are, looking at here.
Globally, we are seeing a shift towards regionalization. Toyota, Stellantis, BMW, they're re-engineering supply to avoid exposure to tariff-prone corridors.
Right?
We're entering a world of economic blocks, and if we are, who's best positioned?
If you see, Chris, I think we are already there, aren't we? So China is strengthening their EV exports and mineral control. The US is playing, defense with tariffs and subsidies like the Inflation Reduction, Act, or IRA, as we all, know it in short form. India is definitely emerging as a neutral sourcing hub, and the EU is caught between the US alignment and the Chinese exposure. So, who's the best position? I think they are those who can flex across blocks with diversified production and software-led, value, capture.
Okay, okay. So let's go region by region. In the US, we're seeing battery alliances like Ford SK,
Mhm.
GMLG. How exposed are we on upstream materials?
Pretty much, Chris. I think the US lacks processing capacity for lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, and you can see that, right? That's why we are seeing deals with Canada, Australia, and even Chile, where we are looking at some acceleration vis-a-vis these developments.
Okay. And in Europe, the threat was a 25% tariff on vehicle exports. How did the
Yeah.
EU respond?
I mean, they simply doubled down on the internal investments. So, be it the gigafactories, the EV incentives, and trade deals like the one with Japan. But supplier hubs, if you look at the supplier hubs in Eastern Europe, they remain still vulnerable and vulnerable to the demand shocks. That's what I can say about Europe at the moment.
Okay, yeah. So India gets talked about a lot. Low cost,
Yeah.
geopolitically neutral, real opportunity, mature enough, or is it just hype?
Well, I must say that the fundamentals are definitely improving, Chris. The PLI schemes, be it the EV manufacturing zones or the rising exports. So, you know, some of those challenges be it with the grid, the bureaucracy, or the logistics. They still pose challenges, but the intent is there, and the incentives are definitely real. So we will definitely see a lot of transformation happening, particularly in the Indian region in the coming few years.
Okay. So let's go where the capital's going. Let's follow the money. How are the OEMs, suppliers, and investors shifting strategy?
Well, I think one phrase, the localize to survive. If you look at Chinese EV players like BYD, who exported over 417,000 EVs in 2024, they are now targeting almost the double, which is roughly about 800,000 in 2025. So what's their playbook? Their playbook seems to be very simple. Build in Thailand, Hungary, Brazil, and avoid tariff choke points. In the US, the OEMs are moving capex into domestic inverter lines, battery plants, and software-defined platforms. So not just for operational gain, but also for policy insulation.
Okay, so strategy becomes geographic, not financial.
Absolutely, yes.
Where you build is who you serve, and the factory becomes your passport.
Absolutely right, Chris. And in fact, the investors have, clocked this already. If you see, Tesla's valuation isn't about vehicles. It's about the control. It's about the control vis-a-vis the batteries, the data, and the autonomy. They have de-risked the supply and maximized monetization. Software eats, tariffs.
Which is why the Stellantis Leap motor wasn't just a JV, it's a geopolitical insurance policy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
OEMs now think in risk corridors, not just in product segments.
Yes.
So, so let's bring in the Shockwave curve. Again, companies often only account for their first order shocks. Prices,
Mhm.
trade volumes dip. But second and third order impacts are where the real erosion happens. Innovation delays, talent drain, lost IP leadership. Can you give us an example of how that plays out?
Sure, Chris. Uh, One example that I would, like to talk about, if you take the if you take the platform development, and if you pause a global vehicle architecture due to uncertain tariffs or input costs, you may lose anywhere between 6 to 18 months in the rollout, isn't it? That's enough. That's enough for a competitor in another region to get first mover advantage. Or or let's take another example. If you consider EV battery plants, if the uh, IRA pulls capital into the US, that leaves gaps elsewhere, triggering disjointed global R&D. Now, the curve, maps how these delays accumulate and hurt your future positions.
Okay, so the curve is not just a diagnostic, it's a forecast tool. It tells you what kind of internal damage might still be coming,
Yeah.
even if the headlines settle down.
Exactly. It's a framework for foresight and not just for the hindsight, where you start, understanding the implications in the short term, in the midterm, and in the long term, and the implications are then first further destructured, or rather deconstructed, in terms of its impact across regions, across the value chain, and so on and so forth. So it's a foresight framework.
2030, future scenarios, what lies ahead? Looking out to 2030, what scenarios do you envision for the auto industry?
Well, I think this is a very important question, right, Chris? Because that's what we were just talking about in a minute back, which is foresight framework. Now, I'll take a couple of minutes. First of all, to answer that question, there are divergent paths. One scenario is, you know, a sustained trade fragmentation, where by 30 we could see auto supply chains split into blocks. Uh, the US-led bloc, which includes North America and some allies, that emphasizes ICE and battery made at home or with allies. The second is the China-led bloc, where we have China and parts of Asia and friendly allies, and they emphasize, their own tech and component suppliers. The third is the EU-led bloc, possibly that splits from the US on data and climate, standards. And in this world, the car designs might even diverge, different standards or different platforms, and so on and so forth. The other scenario is partial, reconciliation, perhaps after a period of adjustment and maybe a change in the US administration. With that happening, some tariffs could come down, but we can only just anticipate if that happens. Now, even then, many investments will have been made. For instance, if dozens of new EV or battery plants are built in the US by 2030 due to these incentives, they're not going away even if the rule changes, right? The companies will have created new regional ecosystems. So what our shockwave curve approach suggests, thinking in terms of the waves. Now, I will talk about first shock term shock, which is about 0 to 2 years, wherein surcharges on imports and production hiccups, starts getting affected. Medium term wave, where in the next 2 to 5 years, the factories start relocating, alliances reforming, example new USMCA rules or Indo-Pacific trade talks, etc. And then comes the long-term tail, which is, let's say, 5 to 10 or beyond 10 years, where new industry structure may be automated, electrified, with clear trade blocks, or conversely, new global rules. So, for example, if by 2030 electric vehicles dominate with 50% or more than 50% share in the major markets, then the incumbent tariffs have inadvertently spurred EV production domestically. On the other hand, if decarbonization policies also tighten with with respect to battery recycling laws or carbon taxes, some companies may prefer importing high efficiency vehicles regardless of the tariffs, and it is complicated. And one last thing which is definitely certain is the interplay of these tariffs with the global mega trends, be it electrification, the software, autonomy, or climate policy. They will shape the outcomes. Now, there can be two views, Chris, that I can talk about. One is a skeptical view, where this all could lead to a more fragmented auto world, raising costs globally, and the optimistic view, wherein I think the it might accelerate modernization of plant lines and boost local innovation. For example, more focus on lightweight materials or synthetic fuels if ICE remains big. Or the key for leaders is to watch and prepare for multiple possible futures rather than just assume a return to 2018's status quo.
Yes. Okay. Got it. Thank you. So let me give our listeners one hard question to take back to the boardroom. If your supply chain disappeared tomorrow, could you rebuild it in a tariff-proof way without rewriting your entire business model? If the answer is no, then you're not future ready.
Yep. And I would just add there, Chris, so stop hoping for normal because it is not coming back. We need to start building modularity, hedge, location, design, resilience as a feature, not just as a patch.
Absolutely. And even with the latest 90-day tariff rollback, the so-called reset, the fundamentals have not changed. It's a tactical reprieve, not a reversal. Leaders
Yeah.
need to use this window to de-risk, not to delay.
Very well said, Chris. And I think the strategic recalibration doesn't wait for policy moods. So the shockwave curve again reminds us that tremors fade, but the fractures will last for a longer time.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. So that is it from us. This has been Trump's tariffs and the shockwave curve. I'm Chris Gearin. Arvind, thanks for riding the fault line with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening. Stay sharp, stay modular, and stay shockwave ready.